Okay, so to start with talking about this article, I want us to sort of step back a little bit because this article works a little bit differently than most of the things that we've seen, and then we'll look into the specific content of it. Just to make sure you guys are on the same page, the article that I'm talking about today is politicizing the minimum wage. So this is the one that we were going to do on Friday, but since we canceled class on Friday, we bumped it to this period. Okay. So, this is a part of a larger set of literature in sociology referred to as social movements literature. Which you don't get a ton of in introduction. But social movements literature basically kind of answers this kind of a question that we have usually. Most of what we've looked at right now addresses problems, right? So we've looked at things that are like, this is what's going wrong here, in this place, at this time, in this way, right? So that basically we've been talking about all the problems of the world. A lot of sociology does that. But social movements, a lot of you probably have the question comes to mind when we talk about these things. What do we do about it? Right? That's often a question that I think most people have. When you're learning about a problem, what can be done about it? Social movements is the area of sociology that specifically deals with what do you do to solve problems. Particularly what sociologists often refer to as social problems. So what do you do to solve social problems? This could be, what do you do to, deal with problems of inequality? This could be, what do you do to deal with problems of race? What do you do to deal with problems of et cetera, right? But social movements in general is going to try to offer tactics or ways to think about and ways of acting that will reduce those problems, right? So it's particularly interested in what things work, what don't, right? What things are going to work and what things are not. Social movements literature in general, which from the name of it shouldn't be surprising, has a tendency to value more like actions of people outside of government actors, right? So what I mean by that is it's different from, so if you're in, if this is political science rather than sociology, what to do about problems would usually have to do with policy, right? So like what policy should we enact? And sociology has a tendency to be more focused upon things like social movements that try to alter and change the world around them, right? Rather than specifically political actors. Make sense so far? Okay, so there's a tension, right, that sort of dances behind this. And we can even think about it too, like, some of the stuff we looked at is pretty daunting, right? So if we're talking about like global inequality where we left off, it kind of seems like on the surface like it's going to be very hard to do things, right, to alter that. So going back to like it's a big question. And a lot of times social movement stuff will often spend a lot of time thinking about what sort of changes have been offered in the past, what haven't worked, why haven't they worked, right? What could be done differently, questions like that, right? Okay, make sense? Cool. In another way of sort of framing this or thinking about it is sociologists often talk about the difference between what they call structure and agency. Originally, this sort of started out as a debate within sociology. It's not usually thought of that way anymore. When it was framed as a debate, people talked about structure and agency. It was sort of like free will and determinism. So initially, when people used to talk about structure and agency, if we were to go back in like the 50s or 60s, they would want to ask, like, to what degree is our actions determined by our social structure around us, institutions, right, the social networks that we belong to, things like that. And I think we talked about the idea of structure a little bit when we talked about time, place, and social structure, right? So to what degree is our actions determined by the structure around us versus to what degree can we act as people, right? And that's usually what it means is by agency. Agency, if you want to think of it, is similar to free will. It's a similar concept. So in sociology, to what degree can we act to change the world around us? Right? So this is the tension between structure and agency. Nowadays, people have a tendency to talk about them less as like either you believe that it's structure, that we're determined by our social structure, or you believe in agency, sort of like determinism, free will, right? Now it's usually often formulated in sociology that we think of these things as in tension with one another. So structure and agency are in tension with one another, and they mutually affect one another. And so if we think of structure less like something that sort of dances above us and determines everything we do, if we instead think of structure like language, I think this makes a lot of sense, right? So we are all bound by speaking in the language we know, right? So like there are rules to how I say things in English that'll determine how I speak. There are only certain words and concepts. Did we talk about the idea, I think when we talked about culture, did I talk about the idea of like the way in which language divides reality, and give the example of like streams versus rivers? Do you guys remember that idea? So like the idea is if you speak French, when you look at flowing bodies of water, you guys, you kind of nodded, like starting to sound familiar, right? The way when we divide them out differently depending on what language, right? And that way language is sort of a structure, but language is also really fluid. And almost most of the sentences you hear uttered on any given day have never really been spoken, right? That there are different combination of words or different combinations of breaking from the rules of grammar, right? There are different combinations, right? So as us as actors, right, are simultaneously controlled by the language we speak, but we also are constantly altering that language, right? It changes over time. You think about it, like language is never something stagnant. It's always moving and changing. That's why different languages develop, right? But that's also like why, sometimes now like they'll translate books that were originally written in English, or if they make translations of books written in other languages, every 30 years they'll come out with a different translation. And the reason why is, to some degree, the English language is altered enough that it's actually useful to do that, right? So you think about it like us as actors fluidly alter the existing language, right? Social structure works the same way, right? In terms of social structure, we're in tension with it. We have the ability to act in ways it wouldn't prescribe, do things that it wouldn't predict, right? But we're also like our choices are limited by the structures around us. Make sense? Another way to formulate this, so one of the theorists that's really important in this moving away from the idea of it being a debate to it being like two things in tension with one another is somebody by the name of Anthony Giddens, who's also a major figure in social movements literature. So Anthony Giddens talks about what he calls structuration. By structuration, Giddens means that we have the ability as agents to act but then our actions often have unintended consequences. Right? And so those unintended consequences often become these sort of, what he refers to as the unacknowledged preconditions of future action. Right? So how might this look? So if we think about a couple examples of things that we've talked about in the past. So last week we talked about structural adjustment policies, right? We talked about these, particularly these ideas of conditionalities being placed on countries, making them more poor. Well, if we wanted to start this process at the beginning, right, to some degree, like the IMF and the World Bank took action. Basically, we have a problem with poverty, and, well, at that time the language would have been used the third world, right? So they took action, right? And now the whole idea of those policies is they were going to reduce poverty, they were going to make the world more equal, they were going to, develop those countries, right? But those had a ton of unintended consequences as policies. So they took action with their agency. That agency had unintended consequences, which means that now any action we take, right, those unintended consequences are the preconditions of that, right? And a lot of those are unacknowledged. A lot of people just plunge forward thinking about developing third world countries as if it hadn't changed, as if nothing had happened, right? Those become unintended preconditions. So our actions now as countries, when we talk about when we talk about international inequality, right, often is structured by what happened in the past, right? So that way we think about it like what Giddens is pointing out here is it's almost like there's a time lag between the two, right? So when we talk about social structure, the institutions we have in place, right, these things are things that happened in the past. Right? So even we think about like, there's going to be an election this year, right? When people go and vote, they're doing so in a system, right, that was previous people's action, right? At some point, people took action to create the system that existed today. Those actions often have weird, unintended consequences, right? And so like when we act today, right, whatever structure we're acting in is shaped by those consequences, right? So we created a certain system of government. The way that government works is going to determine what you can do in the future, how you can act, what you can do, right? So this gets us into this tension, right? So that when they're not opposites, they're actually just different moments in time, right? Structure is the future, right? In some ways, what we do now will be the structure of the future. What we live in now is the actions of the past. Right? Make sense? So in terms of social movement theory, the way to think about it is like, when sociologists, when we talk about problems, we're talking about this. Right? So most of our semester, what we've been doing is we've been looking at what are the structures surrounding X, Y, and Z. How do we explain, right, why we have global inequality? How do we explain, right, why we have this week, right, why we have the sort of like racial tensions that we have in the world? How do we explain, right, gender differences, right? How do we explain, and all those things are talking about structure. How past action, right, has created what we live in now. Social movements theory is going to be more interested in this moment, right? It's going to be more interested in determining what kind of actions may or may not be beneficial, useful, helpful, or effective. Right? Make sense? Okay. So getting from there to our article. Oh, I wanted to give another example just because this is a pretty abstract concept in some ways. The other example we could take is the idea of prisons. When we were talking about prisons altering the society we live in. If we think about it, when people developed prisons, and we talked about this before, they were basically like a humanitarian thing. Right? It was going to make prisoners better people. It often had this religious impulse, particularly like the prison system in the United States were built by Quakers. usually, right? And so it had this sort of like idea of like, we were just gonna make humanity all the much better, right? But what actually ended up happening is, as the prison system grew, as the policing system grew, mass incarceration became a problem. Nobody sat out when they built prisons. It was like, you know what? I think we should lock up 10% of the population of our country, right? I think that sounds like a great idea, right? Nobody started out there, right? But those actions had these unintended consequences, right? Which shape the world around us. And often we become, and this is kind of like that moment, right? We become sort of, and this is kind of what Giddens is trying to capture, we become sort of like stuck, right, in the actions of the past, right? Karl Marx talks about dead labor. This is like one of his favorite metaphors. This sort of image is this idea of like, we basically live in a world where like actions are like zombies. They stick around forever, right? Actions constantly resurrect themselves, and so all we're doing is he says, animating dead labor. Right? Other people's actions, other people's work, right? And we're just animating it over and over again, right? And we're often stuck in that. It feels natural and right, so we just reanimate it. We just keep it going, right? But in reality, things can be changed a lot more easily sometimes than we give it credit for, other than the resistance that's created over time. Okay, cool. Is all that clear? Wonderful. So the version of social movements theory that our article for today is specifically looking at is something called resource mobilization theory. And depending on where you fall inside social movement theory, the kind of questions you're going to want to ask are going to be really different. Some social movements theories sort of assume we don't know what we should be doing, right? So there's sort of this mystery of it, right? Figuring out what would actually be good for the future is they're going to be their main goal, right? And this could be things like an identification of what specific problems are around us, and then trying to talk about like how could we think about acting, right? Resource mobilization theory is a little bit different. It kind of assumes that we know what has to be done. In particular, in this case, resource mobilization theory is often identified with past movements of some sort. So it's sort of like assuming, right, that like a good example of this. I'll stop talking in the abstract. So like if you take something like the Black Lives Matter movement, right, that's going on right now. If you were aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement, you might not really be that interested in these other forms of social movement theory that's theorizing like how do you make change in capitalism or something like that, right? Something big and broad where you're trying to figure out like what is the things we should change, what the agenda should be. Those questions, they might interest you, they might not, right? You might be, if you're a part of that movement, you might be interested in promoting the goals of that specific movement. That's usually what happens in resource mobilization theory. In resource mobilization theory, instead it's going to look at how is it that past movements have used, right, its resources, right? And it's broadly defined. It could be the people that they have, right? Could be, in this case, opportunities within the government, right? And it does this. It figures out how past movements use their resources so that you can, in essence, sort of like find ways of utilizing what you have at your disposal. Right? So each movement has some combination of things that are beneficial and harmful to it, right? And so often people who belong to movements will use this resource mobilization theory as a way of deciding what's actually going to help them, right, achieve their goals. So to some degree, the goals aren't the questions in this theory, right? And so like often what goals are being obtained is not something that's super interesting to people, but instead they're interested more in the question of how do you obtain it, right? It's practical. If you want to think of it, like resource mobilization theory is kind of like the business version of social movements, right? It's not the abstract theoretical version of it. It's often kind of the cut and dry. How do you actually achieve success as a movement? Because inevitably most movements are trying to do what? Most social movements that exist out there. What do I mean by social movement? What would be an example? So I gave an example, right, like Black Lives Matter is an example. What might be another example of a social movement? Other than the minimum wage movement in Indonesia. What might be a different example of a social movement?
Like the pro-life movement?
The pro-life movement could be another example, right? They have a specific goal in mind, right? And you could use resource mobilization theory the same way for that movement. Yeah.
Like feminism and equal opportunities for women.
Yeah, and like usually when we talk about social movements, it'd be really specific versions of it. So you could think about like the Me Too movement was a movement within feminism, right? So any of these things, yeah. Usually social movements are non-government actors, right, who intercede inside of policy, right? So they're outside of the government, but then they actually like try to enact change and difference in some way, right? They're usually regular citizens. And it's usually a mass number of people. They show up and they disappear. Right? So when I was in college, the big thing was Occupy, right? Occupy. Has anybody ever seen? I think I mentioned this like offhandedly in class before. Has anybody ever seen or heard of Occupy before? They're the ones who wear Guy Fawkes masks all the time, those white and black masks with the curly mustaches, and they would just do things like basically create like camps of tents in public space, and usually privately owned spaces in major cities as a protest, right? And they were protesting sort of like corporate corruption kind of things, infiltration into the government. Anyways, so that was a movement, right? It happened, and then eventually, like most movements, it sort of dies out, it loses momentum, it's over, right? You can think about like older movements, like the civil rights movement, like as we broadly define it, right, was a series of different movements within it, right? So you might get like the Southern Christian Leadership Council. That's what sorry, I'm blanking on the name all of a sudden. Why am I blanking on his name? Martin Luther King, middle-aged aphasia. Anyways, so he was a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Or you get things like the sort of black separatist movements, things like Black Panthers, right? Stuff like that. Those are all separate movements that combine together we refer to as the civil rights movement. And all those were examples. So any of those groups, right, hypothetically that we talked about, right, regardless of what side of the policy spectrum they're on, could use resource mobilization theory as a way, right, of achieving their goals. Make sense? Cool. So with all that in mind, let's turn to the article. So what is our movement in the article? What movement do we have happening? Where is it at? It's in Indonesia. Does anybody know where Indonesia is? Nobody knows where Indonesia is? Or are people just being shy?
It's near China.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Southeast Asia, right? Not a particularly wealthy country within Southeast Asia, right? So like thinking about like, we could take this and think about the global context of what we're talking about, right? Massive inequality between nations. Indonesia, right, is one of those peripheral countries, right? Indonesia is also one of those countries highly indebted to the IMF and the World Bank. It has all kinds of financial issues, right? A lot of issues with poverty, right? And inequality. Okay, So within that context, what is the specific policy being sort of fought about in this article? The minimum wage. Does anyone know what happened with the minimum wage? Let me touch this. We can pick up at any point in that story and move backwards and forwards.
Didn't they like massively increase or significantly increase?
Yeah. So there was a group that managed to, significantly increase the minimum wage. So it's increased the minimum wage, right? And so we can look at like the question that this article is looking at is how? Right? Because it seems like, especially if we think about all the things that we've been talking about, would you expect that a bunch of lower working class people in Indonesia would have the ability to force increased wages for themselves? No, so this is an anomaly, right? This is something that happened that really helped that population. If you're interested in alleviating poverty, the question of how they managed to do that is an interesting question. Right? And so that's kind of the starting point of this article is how did they manage to do that? Okay, so does anybody catch what had happened before they managed to increase the minimum wage? This is the thing that happens with the councils, the minimum wage councils. Yeah.
Is it like the wage restraint, how they would like just barely move it up to like meet the legal benchmark?
Yeah, so there was, before what had happened is there had been a wage restraint. Who created the wage restraint?
Is it the wage councils?
What's that?
The wage councils?
It was the actions of the wage council, but who under whose, I guess like whose political sway? They may catch how the wage councils came into being. Who had it before? Who usually runs minimum? This is a weird way of doing minimum wage, right? So who normally sets the minimum wage?
The government?
Yeah, the government. We have two sets of minimum wages in the United States. Does anybody know which actors can set the minimum wage?
Just like the federal and the state government?
Yeah, we have a federal minimum wage, and then a lot of states have their own minimum wage, which is set a little higher, right? And that's exactly what, and usually what happens is after so many years, as the standard of living goes up or down, the minimum wage moves, and this happens in most countries, right? You guys have you guys heard of any debates about minimum wage in the United States before? Yeah, this is something that's often debated. We haven't really had an increase in a while. There's a question of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Whether it makes a difference whether we change the minimum wage. There's all kinds of debates about that, right? Anyways, getting back to the point that, right, so what they were is they were experiencing kind of like a gentle increase in the minimum wage. I'm actually going to redraw this. Because it was their federal government of Indonesia, was increasing the minimum wage slowly over time. They had sort of set increases, they were following their plan, they were increasing them slowly, right? A little bit different than how we do it in the United States. A lot of countries have set increases in their minimum wage. In the United States, it's just basically whenever somebody can force through a rise in the minimum wage, that's when it happens. Until then, it doesn't. So, okay, so you have the federal government increasing minimum wages. Who, generally speaking, does not want minimum wage to be increased?
Corporations.
Yeah. And so we're thinking about, like, especially in the context, right? We don't think of it as like here, where in some ways there is some corporate exploitation, but it's not as high. Think about it in the context of what we were talking about before, right? With corporations sort of like being this proxy weird form of colonialism, right? So corporations are extracting resources from these regions, not really paying people, right? So corporations don't like that the government of Indonesia increases the minimum wage because it increases their cost, right? So what do? They force these wage councils into existence, and who do they make sure it gets put on the wage councils? Themselves, right? There's a language of people working together to set the minimum wage that's used about the wage councils, but it doesn't really happen in practice. So where are the wage councils? At what level of government? Did anybody catch this? There's a lot of them, right? How local are they? They're very local. It'd be like, so like, rather than, if you think about it this way, and this is a very chaotic system, right? Which is done on purpose, because, you know, if you can create chaos, you can often control it easier. So like, this is done on purpose, right? So it'd be more like if every township in America set their own minimum wage, rather than the federal government. Right? And so it's these small little wage councils, and essentially what it is it basically like becomes a way of corporations sort of using local corruption to kind of just take over the wage councils, right? So that becomes what happens, right? Okay. So we have wage restraints, and this is under the wage councils. Okay, so what happens? And this is where like unions are in play here. Are unions very powerful in most poor countries? No. And so in Indonesia, they're not very powerful either. They're just basically groups of people who everybody ignores, right? Because also, like, you know, unlike here, how good are the restrictions to make sure that people are safe in poor countries usually? They're not very, right? So all the rules that sort of like govern what companies can and cannot do to you, like all the workers' rights sort of stuff, like that only exists in Western democracies. Every place else in the world that's been, well, and that's actually thinking about conditionality. One of the conditionalities is that those laws don't exist often, right? Because that would keep companies from extracting resources, which initially, not to be too hard on the IMF and the World Bank, right? Initially were things that basically like they thought would get in the way of business. So they removed them, right? So there you're talking about populations that form unions with no protections at all, right? The unions are very weak. So what do the unions manage to do, though, with the wage councils?
Local government.
Yeah, they manage to get into their local governments, right? We're talking about a population that at the federal level would have had no sway at all, right? But at the very local level, they managed to actually do something, right? And they managed in some places, not all places, but they managed in some places to get the people on the wage councils. That's when that sudden leap happened in the minimum wage. So all of a sudden, there's a sudden leap in the minimum wage in some parts of Indonesia. Does anybody catch what happens in the story from there? Which maybe seems depressing, but is actually still thought of as being a positive outcome in the world of resource mobilization theory. Are there wage councils in Indonesia anymore? I see some people responding with their heads. Does anyone want to respond with their voice? There aren't. Right? The federal government dismantled the wage councils. They took back over the minimum wage, and now we're back to the slow increase. Right? So this is basically the story being told here. So why is this story significant to people who are interested in social movements? Why might this be interesting? Oh, by the way, did anybody the reason why I switched to the federal government is essentially the corporations forced it back into the federal government because they didn't want the sudden wage increases in places. So that's basically what happened. So now across Indonesia, you're getting these nice, smooth, right, wage changes, which isn't great, right? So it's not a huge victory. This is kind of a vanilla victory, right? So what's interesting about it? What do you think? Just looking for
I
guesswork.
feel like it kind of shows, since we're trying to get, if you're trying to fight for people who don't have their wages, so often I think they make an enemy of the corporations, but in this case, the corporations are kind of, they hold the power. So they were the ones who gave the, like handed the wage council back over to the government. So you kind of, I don't know, like you kind of go in the same way.
Yeah.
If you can get the corporations to kind of like work with you in that sense and also work with the government.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know, like how to explain it, but the fact that the corporations handed the wage councils back over to the government in the end was kind of what corrupted the whole thing in the end. So that was like the failing point, and if that didn't happen, they would have been able to keep doing what they were doing. So
Yeah.
that's like the fail.
Anyone want to react to that? It's not probably how the article would talk about it. So the article kind of looks at it as more like the corporations just end up leaping in there to put a stop to it because the people are increasing their wages. So they're still taking like in some ways hostile action against, right?
That's true.
So like it's sort of only because they succeeded already that the corporations sort of,
Yeah.
you know.
Because I guess
It's a
like,
good guess, but yeah.
I guess like because it's the article, because if you look at the corporation, because obviously the corporation is kind of block between you and getting fair wages.
Yeah.
But if you could find a way to, and it's different obviously in different countries too.
Yeah.
But like I know in America with the wage, debate, it's often, you know, the corporations don't want to raise their wages because then all their prices have to go up as well. So it's like having that conversation because it's just the whole thing together. If you can work with the corporations, it's probably the only way you can make progress with it. But I don't know.
Yeah. Any other reactions or thoughts? What else might be a reason why this is interesting? What level of government do we usually intervene in inequality? Yeah, you're usually going to intervene at the federal level, right, for inequality policies, right? Especially like, if you think about like, who generally funds things to help people in third world countries, peripheral countries? What's that?
Other countries or like other organizations?
It's usually going to be people who are concerned about it from wealthier nations. And usually, if you think about most of those organizations, they're going to interact with the federal government or they're just going to act outside of government, right, and relocate money, right? Neither of which work very well, historically speaking, right? What might this point to that you could do differently?
It's more effective if it's the locals who are doing it instead of outside factors.
Yeah, it's more successful. That in some ways, it's more successful if local people do it, and it's more it works better if it's at a local level. That small scale. That's its point. That point of the article is that often we think about helping inequality in other countries, and we think about big scale, right? And they're like, actually, like in some of the, in this case, what this case study points to is it might be more effective to do it differently, right? It might be more effective to get to fund local actors to take local action. And that might actually accomplish something, even at the federal level. Because like these big wage increases, they didn't happen everywhere. They only happened in certain places in Indonesia, right? But it was just enough, right? So in a lot of ways, like that's kind of the question in terms of resource mobilization theory is here it's sort of saying like, hey, if you want to enact change, what level of government should you do that at? Especially in these places where it's really hard to enact change, right? And federal government is usually pretty much owned by who in poorer countries? Just thinking about the history we've been looking at. Pretty much backed and owned by corporations, usually, right? So corporations infect this sort of democratic process of most of these countries, you know? So here we're in sort of this weird system where interacting with the government is not always super helpful, right? Makes sense. Do you guys see this as an example of resource mobilization theory? Do you guys see how social movements theory is different from a lot of the other perspectives we've been looking at? Yeah, cool, wonderful. Real quick, we got 5 minutes left. I want to talk about one set of terms. This is sort of set up for next week. Just to make sure we're going to be on the same page. So I want us to understand race, ethnicity, and difference. Is anyone familiar with these terms? Okay, so let's start with race and ethnicity. Does anybody know the difference between race and ethnicity? What's ethnicity? What determines what group belongs to what? If you have an ethnic group. What's that?
It's like it's your heritage, so you pass it on.
I would say ethnicity is more connected to culture and region.
Yeah. When we refer, oh, go ahead, Charles.
More of like a social group.
Yeah, yeah. So ethnicities, yeah, they're social groups, they're cultural, right? And they often have long traditions, right? And there's a lot of different ethnicities all over the world, right? These are individual groups. They're usually organically formed somehow. Okay? They're formed by people being together, practicing the same culture, living the same lives, right? Speaking the same language, right? All that sort of stuff. So various different ethnicities, that's what we use the term. So it's a cultural term. What's the difference between race and ethnicity? What makes something a race?
Isn't it like the genetic makeup of like people?
So yeah, race is essentially, it's an artificial ethnicity born out of perceived biological differences. Right? Now I say perceived because, and this is maybe a longer conversation than we can have in the next 3 minutes, and we should probably still pursue it, right? But we say perceived because races are also socially constructed. Also, race has a very recent history. It only comes along with colonialism, so it's only in the 1600s that we start getting people talking in terms of race, right? Ethnicities are much older, right? They're not necessarily hierarchical. Race usually is, right? So we rank order and value people differently on the basis of biological differences. That's how races are constructed, right? Make sense? Okay, difference. Difference is any hierarchical organization between groups. So we have a lot of different forms of difference, right? In forms of difference, one group, the dominant group, understands themselves in contra, against, right, some other subordinate group. So a good example of this, and that's neither a race or an ethnicity, would be gender, right? Masculinity is defined as being the opposite of femininity, right? Whatever we talk about with women, right, that's essentially like how men talked about women in a way to understand themselves. Does it make sense? So the same way like race is a form of difference, right? It's a social construction by white Europeans who used it as a way of defining how they were culturally different than black people. What we were basically talking about in terms of colonialism, right? The idea of savagery, et cetera, right? So when we talk about the social construction of race, difference is very old. Race is not, right? So people have often talked about other groups of people in terms of difference, but what those differences are not the same. And so there's an important distinction to be made there. Okay, all that makes sense? Cool. If you have more questions about that, I'm already 1 minute over. We'll talk about it on Wednesday a little.